be arrogant or quick-tempered, or a drunkard, or violent, or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine, and also to rebuke those who contradict it. We'll end that there. So when in verse 7, we covered the attributes of arrogant and quick-tempered, and so the next two attributes that Paul lists is that the man cannot be a drunkard, and he cannot be violent. Now, on the outset, I'm hoping that the reasons for these are fairly obvious, but we'll still discuss them regardless. So the first one we'll talk about is the word drunkard. And when it's talking about this, the word drunkard in the text comes from paroinos, which literally does mean one who is drunk, or specifically one who is given to much wine. And we kind of understand generally about the problem of being a drunkard, but why do we not want a minister who is a drunkard? What practical implications does that entail? And of course, there's a few different directions we can take this. But number one, it is a bit difficult to prepare for a Sunday message while you're inebriated. Alcohol is also known to tremendously alter the mind, not even just when you're drunk, but also from continuous consumption of it. And in a role that requires so much use of the mind, having a man fulfill that role who is frequently inebriated or drunk may not be a good choice. Number two, when you are drunk, your behavior is entirely altered, generally speaking. Your mind is distorted. All mental barriers and willpower are abolished, and your behavior is consequently affected. And one of the key effects of being drunk is a complete depletion of willpower and personal discipline. And so any kind of willpower and discipline that you have, or that this candidate here for eldership might have had in adhering to all the other attributes required for eldership, can pretty much be tossed out the window after too many drinks. Because not only do you commit the sin of drunkenness when you are drunk, but you can have the tendency to pretty much commit every other sin under the sun when you're drunk as well. One example, I think, is a man who's completely dedicated to his wife in every aspect of life, loving, gentle, selfless, loyal. When under the effects of alcohol, he might turn into a man who is mean, might turn into a man who is harsh or selfish or greedy or adulterous. So alcoholism entirely disrupts and destroys a man's mind and behavior, and as such has no part in the life of a man who is trying to pursue God's heart. And I think, again, you kind of have like a double whammy, so to speak, because not only is being drunk in and of itself a sin, but being drunk can also lead you to commit multiple other kinds of sins as well. So it just really starts to get compiled, and that's one of the why being drunk is such a dangerous thing here. Before we move on to the third reason, though, I want to preface it by reading 1 Corinthians 9:24, if you'll turn there. 1 Corinthians 9:24, and we'll read through verse 27. This is the same author who's writing to Titus here. He's now writing to the Corinthian church. And in verse 24, Paul says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Now, in this passage, Paul is discussing the immense strides he has to go to, and the Christian has to go to, in order to avoid sin and to continue to remain steadfast in gospel proclamation. And we can apply this text to what it is like to keep or avoid all attributes that Paul is listing in Titus and what the Christian life is like in general. But what Paul is doing here is essentially comparing mortifying sin to the process of training your body for a particular race or a particular physical achievement, like winning in a certain sport. Because when you are trying to achieve something, when you are trying to work out, when you are trying to place your body under this kind of rigorous, consistent physical stress, it's usually for a reason. It's usually because you have some kind of end goal in mind here. Maybe you're trying to compete for a race. Maybe you are trying to compete in sports tournaments. Maybe you're trying to go to the Olympics and so on. And Paul's point is that while these things are, sure, it's an achievement, but the prize is still something that is perishable. And as Christians, when we are disciplining our bodies, when we are disciplining ourselves for the work of the church and for the life of the ministry and for following Christ, it is for a prize that is not perishable. It is for a prize that is actually eternal. And so if training for a prize that is perishable requires that consistent daily pursuit of God and that consistent beating of your body, then how much more so ought that to require for a prize that is eternal? And that's the idea here that Paul is getting at, that he's trying to explain that when we mortify our bodies, that when we're resisting sin, it's not for something that's unimportant. It is for a prize that is eternal and that will last. And so we're doing it for the sake of walking in obedience to Christ so that we may be more connected to Him, so we may love Him more, so that we may understand Him more and be holier as God has called us to be, so that we may more effectively spread the gospel and influence the world for the one who gave His life for our souls. And one of the requirements that he is listing is we need to make sure that we are daily calling our bodies into submission. That we are calling our bodies into submission. And which brings us back to our third point about drunkenness, which I'm going to more specifically be referencing alcoholism. So if you fall into the trap of alcoholism, you have obviously formed an addiction to alcohol, which is in complete contradiction to this principle that Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 9. So instead of beating your body and making it your slave, your body has beaten you and made you its slave. Quite literally, since now your body is formed almost, if not completely, a biological dependence on alcohol. Your body becomes dependent upon the very thing that is killing it. And this thing that is a curse and murderer of your body is also leading you into more sins. But it's also, too, not just with alcohol, and I think that's another point that we do need to be aware of. Of course, this is the criterion that Paul's listing for eldership, but we also can broaden this, I think, to pretty much any substance or anything to which people become addicted and are harmful. Think of drugs, cell phones, social media, sports, TV, food, gambling. And I'm sorry to say this because I might get kicked out of the church, but coffee. So while the impacts and while the potential for sinfulness on each of those can vary, the concept is still the same. In the case of an addiction, your body is in control of you, and you are not in control of your body. So you're not the one beating your body into submission. Your body is the one beating you into submission. And if you allow your body to become the victor in an area of life and to legitimately subdue you in an area of life, then all other areas of your life might and probably are going to soon follow. And so, yes, again, this is talking about drunkenness specifically, and I don't want us to lose sight of that, but I also want us to understand that addiction in general is something that we should be wary of as Christians. Even if it's not just for alcohol, we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back and praising ourselves for not being addicted to alcohol or some kind of drug or anything like that. We also do need to make sure that we're not being subdued and beaten by our bodies in other areas of life as well. Because, of course, though, you still can have other addictions and still qualify for eldership, because being a drunkard is one that immediately disqualifies you, however. And it does need to be pointed out that while being drunk is a sin, what it is talking about here is a drunkard. It's not talking about a verb, but a noun. So being a drunkard is not a reference to someone who got drunk at one point in time in the past. It's a reference to someone who is habitually getting drunk. It is an ongoing sin in this individual's life. A fourth reason that being a drunkard is harmful to the church is more of on the social level, a really great way to ruin your own personal reputation is to be drunk. The behaviors and actions of a drunkard when he is drunk are so deviant from socially accepted behavior that people will generally think differently or poorly of you from that point onward. And having that kind of social stigma that is attached to a drunkard, to have that be associated with a leader in the church will surely make people not only think less of the church leader, but of that particular church as a whole, making it so people will likely not want to come to the church or be around the kind of congregation that supports that kind of individual as a leader. And it can be an issue, because if people don't wish to attend that church, then you have limited the amount of people who will potentially hear the gospel proclaimed. And of course, social pressures are relevant generally, and we do not do what we do for the approval of society, but there is still a level of care and significance we need to give societal perception. We shouldn't be altogether careless of how we appear in the eyes of society as a church. Now, all of that said, I believe this discussion would be incomplete without a brief description of the perception within the church of drinking alcohol in general, because this perception is going to and does affect the way some people interpret this passage in Titus about how a minister is disqualified if he is a drunkard, so we do need to address it. Now, when it comes to alcohol in the church, you really have two main views. One is that it is acceptable to drink alcohol so long as you do not get drunk. It is thought, of course, that drunkenness is the sin and not drinking alcohol itself. So in that view, it is perfectly acceptable to drink so long as one does not get drunk. The second view is that drinking alcohol is basically a sin. Maybe not actually a sin, but basically. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, alcohol, after all, is bad for the body, bad for the mind, and can lead to drunkenness, and can aid in the formation of alcohol addiction. And therefore, based on biblical wisdom, one should completely abstain from alcohol altogether. Due to alcohol's addiction-forming tendencies, drinking any alcohol whatsoever is basically a sin. And so it is to demonstrate a complete carelessness for where it can lead you. Since drinking alcohol can lead to sin, drinking alcohol is a sin. And so it's a slippery slope argument. But if we were to look at this biblically, and of course my goal here is not to give a full exposition of alcoholism in Scripture, but if we were to look at this biblically, we are consistently told in Scripture that being drunk is a sin, but there's not an explicit text where we're told that merely drinking is a sin. However, there are multiple verses in Scripture that warn against alcoholism and stress that we use discretion and be extremely careful when interacting with that kind of substance. We see a lot of this in Proverbs. Just reading through the book of Proverbs, you will see several references and several instances in Scripture where it is telling you to be careful and to be wary. And for example, I think I really like Proverbs 23, 30, 35, if you want to turn there real quick. Proverbs 23, verse 30, and we'll read through verse 35. And this is from a king, as in a man who had access to alcohol in abundance. And in this text, he says, "Those who tarry long over wine, those who go to try mixed wine, do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart will utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, like one who lies on the top of a mast. They struck me, you will say, but I was not hurt. They beat me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake? I must have another drink." So here he is talking, of course, about a man who is addicted to alcohol and to this substance. And he is, again, in this text, advising inversely here that we use caution and that we handle this very, very seriously. And we see multiple verses like this in Scripture that gives us this kind of warning. So I think we can understand why people believe it is better for Christians to just stay away from it. Yet also, I think the thing that kind of helps reinforce that in people's mind is I think everybody knows individuals whose lives have been wrecked by alcohol and have firsthand experience seeing the effects that it has on your life. And I know I have people in my own family who struggle with this same thing immensely. And so it just reinforces the notion to some that it's probably best to just stay away from it. And that is a completely fair and valid proposition. I don't want us to discount that. Alcohol certainly can be a horrible thing, and it can just create massive addictions. It empties your wallet, it empties your brain, and it empties your soul. However, with all things, it is something that does need to be handled with Christian wisdom and Christian discretion. I think Romans 14:21 is a good verse for this because that's the rather famous verse in which Paul tells us that it is good to stay away from alcohol if it causes your brother to stumble. He does not say it is good to stay away from alcohol and then just put a period there. No, he says if it causes your brother to stumble. So there is a condition that has to be met in order for you to stay away from alcohol. And it is the condition of if it makes your brother stumble. However, based on the other passages in Scripture that talk about using wisdom with alcohol and the sin of drunkenness, I think we can add another condition that would make alcohol something to stay away from. And it would be if it causes your brother to stumble and if it causes you to stumble. Stay away from it. So it's something to stay away from if it causes you or your neighbor to stumble. Now, the reason I bring all of that up is due to the stigma that alcohol in general is sometimes looked upon within the church. You know this especially if you have grown up in a Baptist church, most likely. Presbyterian and Lutheran, maybe not so much, but probably a Baptist church. So maybe this situation seems familiar to you. Someone in the church says, "Well, I was out last Thursday evening at Olive Garden, and I saw Pastor Johnson there drinking a glass of wine with his fettuccine Alfredo. So tomorrow, we're holding an emergency meeting with the board of directors and our elders to start a search for a new pastor." And I wish that were hyperbolic. But we need to remember that this text is talking about a drunkard. So drinking alcohol, based on Titus, is not a disqualification for ministry. We cannot stay away from every single thing that can lead to sin. That's the danger of these slippery slope arguments, right? And they're considered an informal fallacy in logic. It is a fallacy because they're not true. Just because A can lead to B does not mean that A is the same thing as B. cause and effect. And so the same thing is here. We cannot, just because something can lead to sin, does not make it a sin in and of itself. So what we do here is we place it within the category of Christian liberty. And anything that falls under that category is something that while we are free to partake of it, while we are free to use it, while we are free to do it, it is still something that has to be handled with wisdom and discretion. And so some people can drink alcohol and be totally fine, while others cannot. And that's totally fine regardless of which camp you're in, but we just have to ensure we treat it the same way that we do all things, with moderation and wisdom. But at this point, I'm going to use a story from the life of Charles Spurgeon to kind of help illustrate this point and drive it home for us. So for anyone who doesn't know, Charles Spurgeon was a 19th century Baptist preacher in England, and he's referred to as the Prince of Preachers, given the title because he's thought to be the greatest preacher to ever live other than Jesus Christ and the apostles and prophets, of course, because of his theology, his diction, his homiletical style, and so on. Now, the interesting thing about Spurgeon is that he really, really loved cigars. And he was quite a cigar aficionado. So much so that probably almost every picture of him that you will see will include him with either a cigar or a pipe. Now, as you can imagine, smoking got a lot of scrutiny even in the 19th century, just like it does now. And so Spurgeon would often get a lot of scrutiny and judgment from fellow Christians about the fact that he smoked. And of course, he was quite aware of that scrutiny because people made it very plain to him. But of course, he did not stop his habit. On one account, a woman approached Spurgeon and asked, "Is smoking cigars a sin, Mr. Spurgeon?" To which he replied, "Only if it is done excessively." But this story I'm about to tell comes from William Williams, who's a man who personally knew Spurgeon and who is writing about his in-person experience of Spurgeon. And he recounts the story, and he says one of Spurgeon's friends and servants, whose name was George, was under the impression that Spurgeon had an unhealthy addiction and a sinful love for cigars. So one day this man sarcastically asked Spurgeon, "Are you enjoying your tobacco again, sir?" To which Spurgeon replied, "I can do without my tobacco a good deal easier than you can, George, I assure you." And then to which George said, "I don't believe you can." And so Spurgeon said, "Well, George, don't smoke again until I do." And so at that point, they made it basically a bet. To see who really had the addiction, one was not allowed to smoke until the other did. So a week passed, a fortnight, and poor old George, he was just dying for his pipe, but Spurgeon was not. George started to want this tobacco so much that he actually asked one of his friends to go to Spurgeon and intercede on his behalf and ask Spurgeon if George would be allowed to smoke. To which Spurgeon said, no, George made a bargain. Let him stick to it. Eventually, George was allowed to smoke, but Mr. Spurgeon did not do so. And to prove his point even harder, Spurgeon actually didn't have a cigar for months after that. So the story drives home the point of not just alcohol, but addiction in general. We're commanded to subdue this world and not let the world subdue us. That's the creation mandate, right? We're also called to make our bodies our slaves, and Spurgeon showed that he merely loved cigars and was not actually addicted to them. He was such a disciplined man that he was able to frequently enjoy a good cigar without cultivating any kind of addiction or sinful, spiritually malignant habit. But it does need to be said, Spurgeon is somewhat of a different breed, spiritually speaking. He was a man who was abnormally gifted with spiritual prowess and discipline, and of course that is not the common case. So likewise, if you are able to drink without forming that addiction or without it leading you to drunkenness, then great. But if you cannot do so, then you should stay away from it and run away from it, just like Joseph did with Potiphar's wife. But bringing this back down to eldership, when we look at a candidate for eldership, the way that this applies, we need to look at it at whether or not they're careless with alcohol. We should not be looking at this description of drunkard to base someone's candidacy off of whether or not they drink, but off of whether or not they're careless with it. So do they demonstrate unhealthy habits? Do they demonstrate an addiction? Are they drinking so much that it borders on a lack of wisdom or a lack of discretion? When they do drink, how much do they drink? Do they get drunk? Does it have control over them? Are they able to go a day or a week or a month without alcohol? Do they clearly have control over it? So those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. If the answer is yes to any of those questions, then we should probably not consider them to be a candidate for the ministry, at least at this point in time. And if he is a man who gets drunk and frequently tends to favor that route, then no. So we ought to be confirming that he is actually not a drunkard, or if he is a drunkard, and we ought not discredit the moral and spiritual integrity of a man just because he likes to have a glass of wine while out with his wife at a restaurant. There is a balance that we need to adhere to with that regard. But that's it on that one. Just wanted to give clarity on that, because I know that is a text that can be abused quite frequently. I say abused, but it's just misused generally. The key is to focus on that part of actually being drunk. But let's move on to the next one. So the next thing that an elder cannot be is violent, which is interesting that this comes up after the attribute of a drunkard, since being drunk can usually lead to that. But I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because, again, I think this one's fairly obvious. You don't want a violent man to be a pastor. You don't want to put a violent man in a leadership position because same reason why you don't want one who is quick-tempered, because leadership is all about approachability. But I do want to make a distinction between violence and protection, between one who is offensive versus one who is defensive. Now, in Greek here, the word for violence in our English Bible comes from the word plektes, which means a brawler or contentious. So the idea here that Paul is getting at is it's a reference to a person who tries to pick a fight with almost everyone he sees. And he is just getting in fistfights everywhere he goes. It's really talking about a person who starts fights, not really one who just finishes them or one who is protecting themselves or those under their care and so on. And I know we live in Texas, so I know this idea is looked on favorably, and I'm just preaching to the choir here. But just because a man has a gun or knows how to shoot does not make him in violation of this attribute. There's nothing wrong with a man who has weapons or tools to defend and protect his family and the people he loves. And honestly, this is probably the kind of person you want in a leadership position in the church or just in your church in general, because that's a man who not only is willing to protect the flock, but who actually knows how to do it and has the tools to do it. So when Paul says the elder must not be violent, he's not referring to a man who is ready to defend his people. He's talking about a man who starts fights, a man who is a brawler, a man who is constantly on the offensive. This man might constantly just take offense at every single thing you say. You might not be able to joke with him or be sarcastic with him, because any kind of thing that even questions his character, he might just be ready to take someone out. This is not a good person that you want in a ministry position. And you might see this generally among more those who are younger than those who are older. And it kind of fits right within the category of one who is quick-tempered. So that is just something that we need to pay attention to, and something that we need to look out for. Is he someone who is always looking to start a fight? But for the next attribute, so we've gone from drunkard to can't be violent. The next one that Paul lists out is that he must not be greedy for gain. And this goes back to the humility aspect that we talked about a few Sundays ago, so I'm not going to belabor that point again here. But suffice it to say that spiritual leadership is all about an increase in responsibility. And anyone who uses spiritual leadership as a source of worldly pride or a way to think that they're better than everybody else, or a person who uses the position as a way to gain money in an ungodly way, like through lying or preaching false doctrine or manipulating the congregation, is completely unqualified for the position. And the way that you tell that is you have to look at their life. That's why when we're selecting an elder, it can't be someone who's really new to the church, because you have to be able to actually watch their life. You have to be able to actually observe them. And you have to actually be able to know them and know their personality, because how else are you going to know if this is the kind of person who's greedy for gain? How else are you going to know if it's the kind of person who's a drunkard, who's the kind of person who is quick-tempered or violent? You're really not. These are items that you just can't put in a resume for and just speak to. These are things that you have to actually observe. These are things that you have to see in practice. And you cannot just take their word for it, because spiritual leadership in the church is so important and so significant, and the repercussions are so eternal that you cannot be careless with who you put in that kind of position, because the consequences of putting a bad man in that position are so horrible. They completely outweigh sometimes any of the good things that can happen. And so we have to be very careful and actually put someone in this position that we know personally, so that the leadership can testify to this man. Yes, I know him, I have seen him, I am friends with him, I know how he treats his family, I know how he treats his wife, I know how he treats his children, I know how he treats his friends, I've seen him in the public sphere, in the social sphere, I've seen how he handles his vocation and all these other things, and I know that he meets all of these requirements. And that is why we need to know him. And that's also why Paul says he can't be someone who's new to the faith. He's got to be someone who's experienced. He's got to be someone who has been a Christian for a while and who knows how to do this thing. Because you can't put a young Christian in charge over old Christians. Doesn't make any sense at all. You've got to have someone who is mature. Otherwise, you just have the blind leading the blind. But that's going to wrap it up for the negative attributes that Paul is listing. Attributes that a spiritual leader must not possess. So now Paul is going to move to the positive attributes. Attributes that a spiritual leader must possess. And so if we look in verse 8, we see that Paul begins this list with the word but, which of course signifies an antithesis, which means that these attributes are going to be contrasted with the prior set of attributes that Paul listed. And in verse 8, he says that the minister must be hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. Now, when we read this list, some of these are probably self-explanatory and don't need a whole lot of description. And they do overlap with some of what we've talked about already, such as being self-controlled and disciplined, a lover of good. And of course, you can probably take the attribute of holy and put it within the same category or same sense as the minister needing to be above reproach that Paul was getting at. But I think the one that's going to stand out in verse 8 that needs a little more elaboration is the word hospitable. Interestingly, this is the very first positive attribute that Paul lists in this set. It comes before holy, it comes before self-controlled, it comes before disciplined. So this one is the first one that jumped out to Paul when he wrote this, which I think is noteworthy. So let's talk about this one. Now, the Greek word from which this English word, hospitable, is taken from in this verse is the word philokenos, which literally means loving strangers. Philo, of course, comes from the word for love, brotherly love, and xenos means foreigner or guest. So you put them together. And, of course, you get philokenos, which means loving strangers or loving guests. But also notice that since we're using the word philo, this means not only being nice to a guest, but loving them like a brother, loving them like a sister, basically treating them like their family. That's the concept. So taking a guest, taking a stranger, taking a foreigner, treating them like family. Why is this important for a pastor? Why is this important for a spiritual leader in the church? Well, number one, strangers and guests will come to your church all the time, both saved and unsaved. They come for spiritual nourishment or physical nourishment or both. And in either case, it is good to accommodate. Feed them spiritually and feed them physically, since that is what our Lord does for us. And that is also what he did in his earthly ministry, right? He not only gave people the bread of life, but he fed them physically as well with the feeding of the 5,000. And God the Father provided the Israelites with manna from heaven while they were in the desert. So this hospitality extends to us talking to guests in the church, making them feel welcome, feeding their souls, feeding them physically as well. But moreover, too, as a minister, you'll likely be called upon to preach or minister in a plethora of settings. Invited to preach at churches or locations you've never been to before, and so usually you'll be preaching to strangers frequently. So being hospitable to strangers and guests is vital for spiritual leadership. If someone ignores the guest and visitor and doesn't even look in their direction and never talks to them, that's not the sign of hospitality. Instead, he must constantly be on the lookout for them, ready to open up his heart to them and proclaim the love of God to them immediately in his own love for them as guests in the church. But there's another aspect of hospitality, and it does not only pertain to a stranger or a foreigner or in the physical church building, but it also applies to the minister's home and time. Because of the nature of pastoral ministry and of this spiritual leadership, and because spiritual leadership is such a practical thing and you get so much on the practical level, a minister must constantly be ready to open up his home to his people or to spend time with them during the week outside of the church. And of course, this is not something that is necessarily owed and not something that ought to be demanded, because I've seen cases where people in the church will demand and get upset when the ministers or elders don't meet with them or don't take them out or don't buy meals for them or don't open their homes to them and things like that. And it can start to become fairly manipulative. It is a two-way streak, but it is still a vital part of ministry. And so anyone, I think, who has spent time with our pastor outside of the church knows how fruitful and beneficial and edifying that time is. I think probably the clearest example I have in my own life is Pastor Weber and Miss Weber have always opened up their home to us. And when Taylor and I were engaged, they had us over to their house frequently and talked to us about marriage, and they cooked for us, or they would buy us meals and all these other things, and it was immensely edifying and humbling, especially because we know how busy they are. And those conversations and time spent outside of church with the pastor can sometimes be just as effective as a sermon, if not more so. But that aspect of time and meeting with people outside of church is so vital for ministry because of how effective it is. And this is the other reason why a spiritual leader needs to be hospitable. Because sometimes, or probably all the time, we don't just need to hear the gospel on Sundays. We need to hear it every day. And sometimes we don't need to meet with Christian brothers and sisters just on Sunday, but every day. We need that kind of nourishment. We need that kind of life to be given inside of us again. And so those conversations and things like that, they need to happen. And especially for those who are struggling with sin, for those who are struggling with leading their family, for those who are struggling with some kind of ongoing sin in their life. Maybe they're struggling theologically. There's a lot of stuff like that that is not going to be accomplished and alleviated through one Sunday. There are times that you will have to meet with these individuals daily because it's a daily process and it's a daily path. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as a leader, it's your role to make sure you're prepared for that kind of weight, for that kind of work that will take to be hospitable. And I think a really good example of this kind of hospitality, too, is found in the Old Testament. So for a while now, I'm just always really fascinated with the hospitality shown in the Old Testament. Like every time a stranger or guest comes to someone's house, the owner immediately starts making them food and drink, brings them water to wash up in, and they make a place for them to sleep. And that's, of course, it's just the culture in general, but it's that immediate hospitality. And that hospitality has become such an ingrained thing that it is almost like a personal insult if that does not occur when you go to someone's house. And so that's what we see with Abraham and the patriarchs. We see it with Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and you see that with the story of David and the locations he went and with the prophets and so on. And so Old Testament hospitality has just always really stood out like that. And it really gives good examples of how to treat guests. You treat them like family. You show them true Christian brotherly love like Christ has done to us. Christ has taken us as strangers into his family, and they have fed us, he has clothed us, he has given us a place to rest. And so in the same way, we do that to strangers just like Christ and just like our Father has done to us. And that is something that all spiritual leaders ought to try to do, and not just spiritual leaders, but Christians in general. Because it's just a phenomenal display of love and can lead to very spiritually edifying conversations. And we should frequently be inviting people to our homes or out somewhere and spending our time and resources on helping others and loving others, because it can lead to the most important thing, which is talking about the gospel. And I, of course, too, just want to still stick with that disclaimer that it's something that can easily be manipulated, and so as with all things, there is balance. And so the congregation must also ensure that they're returning the favor to spiritual leaders and inviting them into their own homes and so on and so forth, because it's not just a one-way streak. Everybody is blessed when they partake in this process. But because of the effectiveness and godliness that is demonstrated by hospitality and the strong practical role that it plays, if one aspires to the role of a spiritual leader, then he absolutely must be hospitable, because it just comes with the territory. But I'll end it there. Any questions or comments before we close today? Okay, I'll close this in prayer. Our Father and our God, you have loved us with an everlasting love. You have shown us mercy and grace. You have given us all these things that we need for salvation, and also you have extended your blessings not just from the spiritual realm, but also to our physical needs, on top of the salvation and the grace